Hey everybody, welcome to Queering Education. We are super excited to have you. My name is Frederick. My pronouns are they, them. I am Out Youth's Texas Gender and Sexuality Alliance Network Coordinator. I will be recording and handling the tech side of things today, and E. Smith will be our moderator. So I will turn it over to them.
Hi, everyone. So great to be here. My name is E. I use they, them pronouns. I am the founder and president of the Central Texas GSA Coalition, as well as the founder of Queering Education, which is why you're all here today. So I'm super excited for this panel, from pronouns to policy change, transforming classrooms and organizations into LGBTQIAP2 plus inclusive spaces. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to KB and let them explain what the panel is all about.
Hey, so boom, I'm KB, pronouns they and them. I'm so excited to be here with y'all and so excited to have this dream team of panelists. So I'm gonna be kind of like orchestrating the show, expect some laughs, expect some tips, expect to be writing some things down because we got some professionals on the call who are gonna relay some great tips for y'all. So essentially, I would love for everyone to just start with explaining a little bit about themselves. Just like I feel like a self-introduction is cooler than me being like, hey, here's your CV or whatever. So I can start. KB, they, them. I'm program coordinator at the Gender and Sexuality Center at UT Austin, and I am Black and queer in America. So I feel hella qualified to have this conversation with y'all today. And other panelists can go ahead and drop in as they want.
All right, I guess I'll go. I am Sam Davis. Pronouns are they, them. I am so many titles. Upper School Library Educational Technologist, and I am also the new Assistant Director of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging at St. Andrew's Episcopal School in Austin, Texas. And I'm Black and I'm queer, and I am of the trans experience, and it's great to be here with y'all.
Hiya. Happy Wednesday. My name is Gwyn Hung. I use she and they pronouns. I'm the assistant director for the Gender and Sexuality Center. And yeah, I am queer, Viet, Asian. I also am a mother of a puppy. So if I'm turning in this direction or you hear barking, I'm so sorry, because he likes my attention. Anyway, and I'm also one of the co-leaders for Austin Queer Asians and also ATX Asians as well. So yeah, who's next?
Hi, I'm Shane. I use Z, her, hers pronouns because they're old school and I'm old. I am the former education coordinator for the Gender and Sexuality Center, so I feel like we have generations of GSC folks here. And my current hat is that I am the community coordinator for the Equity Office of Austin Independent School District.
Great. So glad that y'all could join us, and so glad to Out Youth and E for putting this whole thing together. I'd love to start with a maybe lighthearted and not so lighthearted note and be like, tell me one thing you don't like about like queer advocacy panels, because I wanna set the tone of like this. So sorry, it's probably a dog barking in the back, but I want to set the tone of this maybe trying to be different than maybe more theory focused panels. So I could start and be like, a thing that I do not like is when the audience is assumed to be folks that don't have that like marginalization that we're talking about. So we're having a whole kind of conversation and thinking that like queerness is not already present. So therefore we're like educating everybody on queerness, educating everybody on like whatever marginalized identity that we have the hat on for at that moment. And while not being cognizant of how our actions may affect the people with those marginalizations on the call or in the room, whichever one. And I'd love to not do that today. I'd love to hope that we're coming from like a practice standpoint today and not like a theorizing about, you know, violence inflicted on like queer people. That's not going to be the narrative. But yeah, I wanted to start with that. What about y'all?
I feel like you just covered everything, KB, in like a nutshell.
Yeah, I also agree with Sam on that one. I will also like to retweet and with a comment. So I'm sorry for all my attendees. Chicago and dry humor, it's just my thing. One of the things that I'm also seeing is that there's been a lot of online webinars and panels, which is great and awesome. And I've been I've been asked to go on panels, and I know other people who have been asked to go on panels as well. But one of the things that I've seen that is very lacking is also being able to compensate the speakers in some form, in some way, for the trauma that they might be reliving as they are talking about their experiences. And it's tokenizing in some sense. But I know that there are places that are finding ways to be able to compensate their speakers. I'm just noticing more and more people are trying to kind of get on the bandwagon, right? But not being able to like offering something in return for all of that emotional labor, all that knowledge that they have.
Yes to all of that. And for me personally, like, I just really miss being in rooms with people. And so for me, like, the Zoom land feels like I'm at the bottom of a well without a bucket. And so please use the chat. Please use, you know, kind of the questions and answers, especially on a webinar. I just feel like I'm enlightening my living room. So yeah.
Love that. Thank you so much for speaking on the times. Translating the interactiveness of panels to the digital realm has been like kind of a learning curve for me. I'm not gonna lie, because I'm a very like boisterous, using my hands and stuff kind of presenter, and I like kind of like using my body as a tool for learning, if that makes sense. So yeah, totally talk in the chat, y'all. Don't be scared to ask questions as we progress through this panel as well. I want to start with your queer career story. And I'm using queer as a stand-in, y'all, for the LGBTQIA2 plus kind of realm. When I think of queerness, I think of someone that doesn't fit straight, cis kind of backgrounds. So that's the terminology that I'm using. It doesn't have to be your terminology, and I respect whatever you use. But yeah, panelists, tell us about your queer career story. How'd you get into this kind of advocacy work, and what has kept you here for the time that you've been here?
I think for me, I think I've always been in advocacy. I've been out since high school. I guess originally I first came out as a lesbian around the age of 16. Then I had a re-coming out again in my late 20s as a person of a trans experience. And then going into the independent school field, private school sector, it's a little unique navigating and being someone who defies the binary. I'm very privileged and fortunate to work at a school who is very open and has been very open and welcoming to me and as well as my students who defy the binary, and being very accommodating. I don't want to say accommodating because who has to accommodate me? I'm a human being, but very open to the experiences that we have in acknowledging that there are people who defy the binary in our school systems and making sure that we feel comfortable within that space. It was very awkward. I came out to the full faculty during our last professional development before the summer 3 years ago. And I literally just stood up and was like, hey, everybody, wanted to make an announcement. These are my pronouns. This is my name now. My name is Sam. And I just want to make sure that everyone calls me by this. And if you have any questions, we can have a conversation. And that's how we left it. I had a conversation with HR about it because I was a little nervous. I was just starting my testosterone. I didn't know if I would be fired. It's an Episcopal school. I'm in Texas. I was nervous. I was like, am I going to lose my job from being my authentic self? And my HR was like, okay, do you need us to call like Blue Cross Blue Shield? Do you need any help with your surgeries? Do you need us to call to make sure we can cover your surgeries? And I was just like blown away. I was like, okay, they're really here for me. So just having a company who really cares about my experience and making sure I felt comfortable being my authentic self, like I said, is a privilege. So I think advocacy has always pretty much been within me since coming out at 16.
I love that. I love that answer because it's for me, my experience has been a whole lot of just like advocating for myself and making sure that spaces can like exist in a way that makes me feel comfortable in the same way that it makes everyone else in the space that doesn't have like the identities that I hold feel comfortable. I'm seeing in the chat a couple of questions, and I want to say that like those things are already kind of built into what we're going to get to. But I'd love to hear from other people. Quick career story. What's got you here? What's keeping you here?
And you want to go first?
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I echo a little bit about what Sam said, and because obviously my life story is a lot different. Coming into terms my own identity, but also realizing like being one of the few folks who had my identity, right? Like I grew up in Chicago being one of the few Asian folks, but also being queer Asian, and I didn't see a lot of that represented in a lot of my spaces. So wondering like, what does that look like? And also being a first generation college student and also a first generation of an immigrant family, right? It was really difficult for me to figure that out. And the reason why I got into my field was because I wanted to have more representation for students or folks who were going into college and universities. But then also being able to have this conversation, right? Because it's taboo at least in my culture to talk about gender and sexuality. And so realizing as I learn more about advocacy work and also about other identities beyond my identities, I realize how important it is to have also authentic but also accurate information, right? And being able to explain people that looks like me, what some of their experiences going through, like the lunchbox experience, model minority, but then also intertwine that with queer identity, or if the person is not queer, also like talking about gender identity and whatnot. So like once when I started coming out in my 20s, right, early 20s, that was when I started realizing how important this work is. And no matter what spectrum of my work it's going to look like. Shane, you can go next. Sorry, I'm really shy.
Trying to figure out how to condense being old, and so my story is long. Right, so I came out in my mid-20s working for the international headquarters of my church, where around my sexual orientation, where I could have been fired if I'd been found out. And I fell in love with a coworker, and I never recommend this as the story. Don't do it. And then I came out and I stayed closeted for a long time because I didn't want to be fired. And then in the 90s, I was working at Cornell University, and by that time I was out and active and doing advocacy and on bullhorns in front of college buildings. And then we brought Leslie Feinberg to campus, and Stone Butch Blues was brand new and hot off the press. And when Leslie walked out onto stage, if you don't know who Leslie Feinberg was, unfortunately, they passed away, but look them up. Stone Butch Blues, I think, changed a lot of people's lives in terms of a model of what was possible. And Leslie walked out onto stage in a gray pinstripe double-breasted suit, you know, shirt and tie, shiny men's shoes, hair in a flat top. And I was like, what? Because I was still kind of trying to do the girl thing. I looked like an awkward drag queen most days. And I was like, I had conformed because my mom had told me that if I didn't conform, I couldn't be successful. And so I'd done my best. And I was like, okay, this person's come to an Ivy League university. They've written a book. My mama lied, right? So, you know, in 1995, we didn't have any of so much of the language that we have now. So I talked about living in the gender gray, and because I was known, like, people started inviting me to classrooms to give talks about it. And I kind of got the bug. Cornell was the first place I went to a social justice long series, and, you know, kind of took the blinders off around race and, you know, kind of social justice structures. So I moved to Austin, and I think it's 27,000. So like people knew me, and I came to Austin in 97, and there was a tiny trans community. There was a little group called the Alamo Boys, and we met like once a month at a coffee shop and had to put an awkward little sign out, and people would like scan and look and be like, are you the table? Are you the table? And so it's really been fun to watch, but like nobody knew me, so people weren't asking me to speak, and I really was trying to figure out how to do this work professionally. And by professionally, I mean for money. Let's just be clear, right? So I ended up going to the School of Social Work because at that time they had a Diversity Education Institute. And when I walked into the school, people said, what do you want to do? And I said, I want to be a social justice educator, especially around LGBT issues. And I don't say that anymore. I say the lives of LGBT people because I don't have issues. Other people have issues. So I'm gonna like flip the script on where the issues lie. And when I got out, I ended up being a therapist for a while because I still couldn't find positions where you could get paid to do this work. So I graduated in 2003, and in 2007, the education coordinator job came open at the Gender Sexuality Center. It was my dream job, and I was the first person to hold that space. And what I found is that the thing I thought I wanted to do professionally is what I love to do professionally. And what keeps me in it is I always learn and grow. The language always changes. I'm like, the alphabet that we're using for this panel, I'm like, oh my gosh, it's gotten longer. Yay! Right, so, and I get to meet new people all the time, and I can't live in my 1995 story because that isn't the world I live in. And so, like, for me, it's, you know, like this work is, it's exhausting and it's dynamic. And I always say that I train and have conversations for the world I want to live in, which is not the world I currently reside in. And so I always get to be kind of forward thinking and pushing, gently nudging. So long story. Thanks for the time. Bye.
Love y'all's stories. Love that y'all are still here after all of these years. I appreciate it, y'all. It was a question posed about race, so I want to get to that. So for queer and trans people of color, right? Or queer and trans Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color, depending on what term you use, right? Our experiences of queerness are vastly different from the experience of those that don't hold two of those marginalized identities. Identity of being a person that is not white, and identity of being a person that has queer or trans experienced. I'd love to talk about how that informs our experience of queer spaces, really candidly. How does race inform your queer experience for the Q, BIPOC people on the call? And what do you wish queer inclusive spaces did to make folks of your demographic feel more included?
That's a mouthful. For me personally, it was really hard coming out. I grew up in the church, and my grandfather was a pastor, so coming out as a lesbian at first was really hard for them to grasp. But coming out as trans, let's just say I don't really talk to my grandfather or my mother in the past 4 years, and we'll leave it at that. I wish there were more safe spaces for Black people to worship who defy the binary, to where they could feel accepted and still have that community. Growing up, there weren't any GSAs in my high school. That I'm telling my age right now. My safe haven was the theater department. I was in theater and stage production my whole high school career. And that was where I found all the cool kids and all the kids who helped me explore and navigate, maybe I am a little different than the other kids at school, or maybe who I think I am is really who I am and being affirmed. But as far as my Blackness, it was a struggle growing up and going to church and having to not be able to be all of me in that space, because it was either you choose to accept your Blackness but not own the LGBTQIA plus 2A in all the acronyms. I'm sorry if I'm messing them up, but I could not own that in the church and be accepted by my family, to be quite honest. And it's still a struggle.
Real. I want to retweet that. I'm also a preacher's kid. My dad is a pastor. So it's hella hard coming out. I think that in my time in Austin, it's just been so interesting to experience queer places, though, because I feel almost like I have to advocate for being Black and being queer and being trans, like, all at the same time. It feels like I can't do that because if I'm in a Black space, I'm very nervous about whether it's going to be like homophobic or transphobic. But when I'm in a queer space, which are the spaces that historically I have gravitated towards more, it's been a whole bunch of just like overwhelming whiteness and not like a critical lens on how that whiteness shows up in the ways that we communicate with each other and the artists that people bring into queer spaces in Austin, and how it communicates even in like the policy that you have around like queer spaces and having so many cops, for instance, at Pride. That doesn't make me feel comfortable personally. You know what I mean? So it's what I would hope for in queer spaces is just more like actual conversations around race and actual like QTPOC folks on like in positions of leadership to where we can design those spaces in a way that works for us as well as works for other folks. Gwen Hung, do you have any ideas?
If I did, I would not be doing this work, right? No, I think that's a really valid, those are really valid, both of y'all. I think another thing too is that like a lot of times when we even talk about race, it's like all of us are lumped together. But when we talk about like all of the communities of color, but also breaking them down to such as like, I'm just gonna speak for the Asian community, right? It's a huge diaspora of Asians. And when we assume Asians, we assume that the East Asian and that's it. We don't talk about like all the diaspora of South Asian, West Asian, Southeast Asian, Pacific Islanders, and so on, and how their experiences are vastly different, right? And also recognizing colonization that also made it really more difficult when there was a ton of conversations and different types of LGBTQIA relationships in those cultures, right? And it makes it more complex when you add colorism into play, classism into play. So it's really important for other folks who are listening to understand how each community colors are experiencing different types of oppression, and it may have similar themes, but it looks completely different depending on the context. So yeah, I wanted to like mention that.
Love that. Thank you so much. Yeah, sometimes like the POC label kind of creates this whole like idea that every experience of non-whiteness is the same. Asian American is such a big label for a large and vast group of people, as well as being Black, because you think of like folks that immigrated from Africa, and then like the African American experience is so different. So yeah, a lot to say there for sure. I want to move into like playing off of the ideas of like younger queer self and what would have made, I'm so sorry for this dog, what would have made our younger queer selves feel included in otherwise like non-inclusive spaces. So take a minute to think about that, and I'd love to hear from y'all.
I mean, I would have liked to have known it was even possible, right? Like, I was at private religious boarding school. I don't even think I knew what it meant or what it was. You know, again, high school for me was 70s. And so, you know, Ellen and I were going to high school at the same time, and we weren't talking to each other about what our futures were going to be. So, yeah, I think, having possibilities, having any language or role models, and I realize my experience is going to be a little different because of where I land in the decades. I appreciate the question that a lot of our conversation is about, coming out in college and GSAs, but man, like, I can't imagine, if there had been a GSA, or again, I grew up as a religious person, right? Like, I was going to apply, one more story, I was going to apply to college at Stevens College, which is an all-girls school in Missouri. And I told a friend of mine that I was going to apply, and she's like, "Oh, you don't want to go there, it's full of lesbians." And I ripped up my application and threw it away. Because like in my world, I didn't want to be where there are a bunch of lesbians. And I often think about like what would have happened at 18 if I had rolled up into Stevens College. Like the trajectory of my life would have been incredibly different. And so my younger self would have liked to have known the possibility. And I'll just add this in because I didn't talk about it in my story, and it fits in this moment. Like, mental health is a huge piece for me in this journey around navigating family and navigating possibilities and being told that I was wrong and awful and a lot of terrible things. And I'll just say that I and that hit in kind of every decade for a while in my life. And I just think how mad younger me would have been if they had followed through on some things, because they had no idea that older me was going to get to be this. And so, for folks out there who may struggle, or for folks who know folks who struggle, like, please have some hope that, futures can be kind of amazing and fantastic if you give yourself a chance. And so I think the other thing that young me, high school me, who I think knew but like couldn't access it, like, hang on, because better, I hate that it gets better, because it gets better is filled with a lot of privilegey kinds of stuff. I will say it gets different, and if you can hold on, sometimes that different is spectacular.
I love that. I love that answer a lot because I think of my younger queer self and I think of just so much insecurity that I had and so much of like trying to distance myself from the idea of being queer because it was not something that was accepted. So if it was just like all of your friends are like gay or whatever, I'd just be like, OMG. And I didn't have a GSA at my high school, and I think about sometimes with and E's work with the Central Texas GSA Coalition is so miraculous because I know that those kinds of things are life-saving, like having affinity groups that you can go to that have similar experiences as you, or that are having the same questions as you. Even you don't even have to have it all figured out, because I most certainly didn't. Yeah, it would have made my mental health look a lot different, in high school. But on the tidbit of like inclusion, I think that just not being so afraid to have the conversation or not feeling like it has to be separate from conversations that you already have. Like right now when I'm talking to like young people, and when I go to K-12 schools, and I'll be like, my pronouns are they and them. They'll be like, what does that mean? And then all of a sudden I'm having a conversation about gender and sexuality with middle schoolers. It's not like they can't understand this information. You know what I mean? I just had like conversations, of course, in like accessible language, that really landed. And then other folks are just like, I didn't even know it was options outside of like man and woman. That's so cool. So those kinds of conversations can be so transformative if you're just willing to have them and not scared of the possibility of like scaring someone away or something like that. But other folks, sorry, what are y'all's thoughts?
I thought about like what would have happened had I seen more representation in my curriculum, and also being able to learn the history of LGBTQ identities, right? And not be like shy about it. Because I know that had I known what I know now, I may have not have had such internal hate for myself when I was a kid. But also learning that there is so much more out there beyond what I saw in the books, because I never saw folks like me, but also even seeing people that I look up to. Granted, I'm 5'1", so I look up to everybody, but being able to like have those mentorship, right, and also being able to kind of be find community, even if community is like in another space. That is still something that was really important for me. But yeah.
I just wish I was brave, honestly. I think I was so scared and so afraid to be my authentic self and so nervous about what my friends would think about me being out and open and just my family. And I was more worried about everyone else's perception of me than about how I felt about myself. It was so damaging to just my self-worth and how I showed up in the world. I think high school was a really big struggle for me, just worrying about everyone else's opinion. So I really wish I could have been braver, honestly.
And I think that our like levels of bravery comes from the environment. Like before I even knew the terms queer or like gay, I kind of already knew that wasn't what I was supposed to be, just because of the attitudes around me. So if we can in some kind of way transform those attitudes and like combat the kind of hurtful language that happens around LGBTQ plus youth, or just youth in general, then I feel like it would then transform spaces into spaces where people feel comfortable with like being who they are. But no, I totally echo that. I was just afraid as a kid, but it was mostly just because I felt like, and it already ingrained in me as a like 12-year-old, having my first couple of like questions around gender and sexuality that it was already like not okay to not fit the like status quo. I'd love to get into a conversation about how classrooms can transform into queer inclusive spaces. How do we make queer folks, trans folks feel included in classrooms? And I know all of y'all have been in classrooms before, so I'm excited to hear some tips y'all may have.
Can you repeat that question? I'm sorry.
Yes. So how do we make our classrooms inclusive for queer and trans people?
List. So, talking about pronouns, asking pronouns, giving pronouns, demystifying pronouns, not assuming people's gender by what you see, or people's sexual orientation by how they look. This got mentioned earlier, right? Like having it in the curriculum, talking about it, and that you know, districts and schools have to have policies and practices. We can't just say we're going to do the right thing, like we have to embed it, because the minute leadership changes, if it isn't embedded, then the right thing doesn't happen anymore. We need to not send students immediately to counseling when they come out, because it sends the message that something's wrong with them when nothing is wrong with them. We need to make sure that people get to be in activities and play sports and do activities as how they identify. We need not to divide little kids up into boys and girls in line and then see Shane like standing in the middle going like, I don't know where to be, I don't know where to be. You know, we have to train everybody in our schools, not just our teachers, right? Like our students are going through cafeteria lines. I get stopped by more by custodians than probably anybody else when I'm trying to navigate bathrooms, right? Like, yes, we need to have GSAs. Like, I think they're great. I also would want to live in a world where people could feel free to join any club and know that they're also going to be okay. Like that's a both and. It's like if we see a little queer kid come up, we shouldn't say, oh, like your club is the GSA. It's like, well, in theater and chorus, right? Like the expectation should be that they can be interested in everything and that they should be, you know, kind of safe and comfortable. Okay, that's Shane's short list.
I love it. It's a short and great list. On that like policy part, I just want to like amplify that so much because unwritten rules really do not work, y'all. Saying that we're going to do this thing and we're going to have this committee that does this thing, but like no thing actually goes into writing. Policy is binding, right? People listen to policy because they know that like this is a thing that everyone in the school is expected to follow, right? So if we're going to have policy around pronouns, that's better than like 3 individual great teachers having pronouns, right? If we're going to have a discrimination statement that includes sexual orientation and gender identity, then it better be, you know, a thing that is in like the actual discrimination statement. So like it has some kind of HR binding kind of commitment there. Yeah, because there's been a lot of just like conversational stuff that I've seen happen in classrooms where it's just like, I personally am going to do this, but like Shane said, as soon as that teacher leaves and like that unwritten rule leaves as well. So yeah. Does anyone else have some short lists, y'all?
For me in the private school sector, it's definitely coming from the top down, getting your board involved, making sure that the parents are included in these conversations. your admin team from K through 12, not just at the upper school. I think a lot of people just think that high school students are the only ones who are dealing with LGBTQIA plus issues and not realizing that students as young as kindergarten are identifying and knowing who they are, and we need to have the language around that. Definitely what Shane said about making sure it's not just faculty getting trained, it's the staff, it's the people in the cafeteria, the bus drivers who know and are aware of how their language can be damaging to students if they aren't affirming them. And definitely checking out your bathrooms and your gym. How does your locker room look? How do your restrooms look? How does your onboarding for people who are coming for away games? How does their locker room look? Are you being accommodable for people who have single-sex schools? What does that look for them? So just being mindful of all those things, especially in the private school world, because we tend to overlook these issues sometimes because we're inclusive, we're for everyone, but it's a lot of blind spots. So just thinking about those things.
Sorry, one other quick thing too is that administration has to be willing to push back if parents push back, right?
Yes.
So, if parents are going to be like, little so-and-so's, in my daughter's classroom and blah, 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 right? Or we don't want a comprehensive sex ed program, or we don't want Shane to visit, right? Like,
you have to be willing to say, well, maybe this is not the place for you.
Right. And, in public schools, we can't say that. But, right, like administration has to be willing to stand up for and against, kind of, whether it's conservative voices or wherever that comes from that wants to make it not okay. And I never want to hear the voice, and Sam just mentioned this, of like, they're too young to know. We never ask straight cisgender students if they're too young to know. You might grow up to be gay. We don't know, right? Like, we have to think about flipping the script on the things that we ask when we think that people are too young to know.
Yep, absolutely. And I think that policy should always have a rhyme and reason to where you're equipped to have those conversations. At the Gender and Sexuality Center, not that this is an ad, but when we talk about pronouns, we have a whole how-to guide that explains why pronouns are important. So if a parent or whoever is to like push back on that point, like, that's weird, I don't, want to do that, be like, well, pronouns are actually important because X, you know what I mean? So putting policies into place, putting things into place, but also having the verbiage behind why it's important equips you better to have those hard conversations. Because silence doesn't help anybody. If you just let anyone say whatever, that's just further perpetuating violence against marginalized folks. No, I love that. Gwen Hung, did you have any stuff?
Yeah, I'll just keep it really quick because a lot of the things were already said, so retweet to the max. One of the things also is to continue learning and also think about it in multiple intersections, right? Because this is not just, we're just talking about in one specific area such as gender and sexuality, right? But we're also wanting to talk about the intersectionality. So is it also, are we talking about inclusive language when we're talking about abilities, right? And supporting our disability folks, are we also making it accommodable or accessible for folks to learn in like another language and whatnot. So yeah, I just dropped 2 links. One, the one is an English version, and the other one's a Spanish version. It's a pronoun how-to guide by the Gender and Sexuality Center. So yeah, and I'm so sorry that I did not spell version right. My bad.
Thank you so much for that.
That's the queer spelling, isn't it?
Oh, LOL. I'm thinking a little bit, about intersectionality there as well, making sure we're being inclusive with our language. And I think that that's also a good tip for like workspaces. So a thing that we said, or a thing that I'd love to talk about, is also making workplaces queer inclusive. And a lot of this could transfer, like definitely pronouns and email signatures and all of those things. But like deeper than that, how do you feel like, or what's made you feel included in a workspace? What's made you feel like comfortable with your queer identity? And how can other workspaces do that?
I'm gonna go first again. I'm sorry. I have a great example in my current work, right? So the good fortune to work with Dr. Stephanie Hawley, who's the Chief Equity Officer. We have known each other previously. And I just remember on my first day coming into work, we were in a meeting and she was like, I'm Dr. Stephanie Hawley and my pronouns are blah, blah, blah. As part of our introductions, you're all gonna give your names and your pronouns. And I didn't have to ask her to do it, right? Like she just knew to do it. And so I think, you know, for me in a workplace, when people are proactive, and so I also asked her because I was, you know, wanted to check it out. And I said, do you do it if I'm not in a room? And she said, I do. And I was like, yes, right? Like it's also about doing kind of best practices or the right thing, right? Like if what you're doing is scanning a room and being like, is there a trans or non-binary person here? I better ask about pronouns. Like, no, like the practice of the organization should be pronouns, right? The practice of the organization should be that there's a bathroom that I feel comfortable using, right? So it really is having an embedded culture, right? So it's policy practices, and when those are really embedded, then it shifts the culture. So, you know, one of the things that I talk about is kind of my definition of equity in the K through 12 space, and I would say this is also true in the college spaces, right? That no one ever has to tuck a part of themselves in when they go into a space, right? That we get to bring our full selves unapologetically into a space. And so when I'm in a workspace that I can do that, that's great. And if people don't know what it is that I need, then ask me if it's okay to ask me what I need. And if I say no, go look it up, there's lots of places that'll tell you what that should look like. So, and if you ask me, because I obviously have a lot of opinions, I will tell you. But that also doesn't mean that that's going to work for everyone else, right? Because I am white, and so there are a lot of things that I get away with in my whiteness that other folks may not be able to. So, yeah, like. And the other thing is we have to figure out the policy and practices piece before we have folks, right? So you don't wait till the first trans person enters and then fix it. Like fix it so when that first trans person enters, they just get to breathe and relax their shoulders, right?
Yeah, definitely echo that last point. Being proactive, not waiting until you have an actual trans person or a person that you perceive as trans to ask pronouns. That is actually so wholly offensive. Like to only ask someone when you think that they are not cisgender, all of a sudden everyone has to say pronouns. Saying that and just making it a commonplace to not gender someone as soon as you see them should just be a commonplace. And having inclusive trans policy and queer policy should just be a commonplace. So let's just like try to be proactive and not reactive in that way. Does anyone else have any points? All right, cool. I'd love to listen to some of the questions that we have. But before we get into that, y'all, I'd love to just hear a queer win for the week. Like, what is a thing that you've been super happy that happened this week? And yeah, just like share a nice thing, because I love hearing positive stuff right now. I don't know about y'all, but everything can feel so negative because global pandemic, race relations are not great, OMG, election year, like, you know, it's just a lot going on. So I would love to hear something positive.
Well, I kind of did a commercial for Procter and Gamble, for Pride. So that's a good thing. It's on like YouTube and Twitter. So that's a positive notion.
How about chill that one? It was like, oh, I just did a commercial. That's true. I found my favorite salsa dip at HEB here. And so I'm just like, look, y'all, I'm a tourist. I love food. And so I was like, it's my favorite salsa. So yeah, that's not me.
I think I have one. I just hit my 8-week for top surgery last Thursday, so I've been giving away free binders, and it's been so cutesy. Being able to like pass the love on of like all 8 binders I have. I still have actually 4 left, so if anyone needs some size XL binders, hit me up.
I'm just gonna use this time to make a shameless plug because it's kind of a win. So AISD is having an equity summit next Tuesday from 1 to 5, and I guess I will put something in the chat box before we go. And you know, I also, I mean, I consider it a win anytime I'm in spaces where people are talking honestly about race. So I consider this time together also a win.
Yay, love it. Love a plug. That sounds cool. I'm actually probably gonna check that out myself. So we have 30 minutes left. That was really all of my questions that I had prepared, y'all. So I'm gonna go through the chat and kind of go through everyone's questions to make sure that we can get to those. Sanford says, I'm really curious to know how discussions of LGBTQ identities, I guess, can be introduced in classrooms. I think we maybe kind of answered that one there, but introducing it as if it's not like an outside conversation, as if it's like a conversation that's already tailored. So if you're saying like, hey, names and pronouns, and someone asks, congratulations, you just introduced LGBTQIA 2+ identities to your classroom. But does anyone else have any other tips there that we didn't already touch on?
Jump back in the frame here. So another shameless plug, Texas State Board of Education is revising the sex ed curriculum standards for the first time since 1997, when Titanic was in the theater, for some perspective. If you want to testify on Monday and tell your State Board of Education member why it's important that comprehensive, inclusive, and medically accurate sex education is the standard across the state, you can register to testify starting tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. Registration is open until 5 p.m. on Friday, and you have to register to be able to speak. It's live virtual testimony, which is a weird first-time thing that we're doing because of COVID. But one of the beautiful things that is being suggested to add to the curriculum is the inclusion of sexual orientation and gender identity as part of the health curriculum, so that students are able to have these kinds of conversations starting in elementary school. So you don't even have to worry about it. It's going to be in the curriculum.
Love it. Love that segue. Love that like commercial that we just got from Out Youth. I love it. But no, yeah, another way to introduce these discussions is making it so the state has to. OMG. So definitely check that out. Thank you so much for that. Are there differences in new messages? Are there differences in LGBTQ plus Within race, it would seem to me that Blacks are more marginalized than whites in this room. Any thoughts on race and LGBT? I think that's also a thing that we covered. I would say Black people instead of Blacks in the way that you use it here. And yeah, there are totally differences, just to like reiterate on that. And a lot of queer spaces aren't always inclusive to queer and trans people of color. So if those are conversations to be had, if you're just like, why does my local queer bar pretty much only have white people there? It's a reason. It's a reason. So it's good to ask those questions. And it's good to, if you're going to ask QTPOC folks for their labor and like making your spaces more inclusive to QTPOC folks, to like pay them for that labor. Yeah.
Can I add a quick thing into that?
Yeah.
And treading lightly in my white skin. But one of the things I often hear is that communities of color are more homophobic than white communities, and I want to dispel that a little bit, right? Like that's really tricky, and it causes some divide and conquerness, and it also lets white homophobia off the hook, right? Like there are lots of white families out there who aren't doing it right. So I just think we have to be mindful, especially when I hear white people say it. So when white people are like, oh, but those families, I'm like, oh no, our families. So just, you know, like I think the experiences are different. And I think sometimes, you know, church might play out differently, and different expectations around gender roles and expectations. But it doesn't serve our community well. It doesn't serve the queer community well to pit us against each other in terms of who's more homophobic or not. So I just want to be mindful. And I think the other thing that's been said, right, is that again, when I worked at the GSC, and there's also a multicultural engagement center, we had a lot of conversation about students having to choose which of their identities were going to be up in which of those spaces. And I bet you got that fixed by now, but we didn't have it fixed back at like, maybe not. Right, but that's also part of equity work, again, is that we shouldn't have to be choosing what part of ourselves and our frustrations we're forwarding depending on spaces that we're, you know, kind of depending on spaces that we're in.
Real. Thank you for adding that. I appreciate it, Shane. Another question, thinking back on your school years, what are some things that teachers did to make you feel safe and loved in the classroom? Even in a system that's racist, homophobic, transphobic, what has an individual teacher done to make you feel seen? And that's from an elementary school teacher.
Honestly, I've never had that happen before. So in my early years, it wasn't until I went to grad school that I actually felt seen, and it was like honoring my name and my history and my people. And the funny thing was that it wasn't even a professor, it was my supervisor who did that, and like try learning my name, try and learn my pronouns and everything like that. So I have no idea. Anybody else?
We're in the same boat. I wasn't affirmed until undergrad from my professors, to be honest.
I could probably count one experience. In high school, we had very gendered kind of dress code things. And it was one professor that did not give me shit, honestly, for dressing however I wanted to. And even though that wasn't like outwardly being like, you are queer and you are here and I'm gonna hug you, it was just like a light thing that every teacher should have been doing, or like the school should have been doing, with not having such strict and gendered dress codes. Other than that, yeah, I'm in the same boat. I didn't really get a whole bunch of like affirming stuff until college.
Yeah, I didn't experience it, but again, like thinking about some of those things that we talked about earlier with that list, right? Like, you know, if I saw things in my classroom that reflected a possible me, right? Like if I heard stories if I weren't being lined up as boys and girls, if I had a bathroom, like bathrooms for me have always been a thing because I'm private, right? So if I had privacy, that would have been great. If I'd seen any kind of role model anywhere that seemed possible for me, right? Like it's about, and pride isn't enough. I'm just going to say this right now. Pride is not enough. Rainbow flags are not enough. And one of the things that often happens is that whatever month we choose to have pride in, because it's an inconvenient month, um, if we aren't backing that up with our policies and practices, I use this analogy, right? So let's say I walk into a room and I see a plate of rainbow frosted cupcakes and I'm so excited, right? Woo! And I run up and I'm like, there I am, a rainbow frosted cupcake. And I pick it up and I bite it and it's half cooked. Right? Then I'm like, man, I just got punked, right? Like I got punked by rainbow frosted, half-baked, nasty cupcakes. So we just really have to make sure that, you know, if we're going to do that, that we're baking a cupcake and all the way through, and that we're serving those rainbow cupcakes 12 months a year.
When I was a freshman in high school, my English teacher was the first one to talk to our class about what GSAs were. And when I was in high school, it was a gay straight alliance. And because she was so supportive, I actually founded our school's first GSA, and she was our advisor. And that was before I realized that I was queer because by erasure. But she also made a point to, she is a Jewish woman and brought in Holocaust survivors to talk to our class, and made a point to talk about how the queer community was targeted during the Holocaust, and made a point to bring that history into the classroom. And so even though I didn't realize that I was being seen, there was someone there offering that space, and it really made a huge difference for me and so many people that I went to school with.
Real. Thank you so much. I'm trying to go in order a little bit here. Should more history of the LGBTQ plus movement be taught in schools? Could you direct me to movements that can be used as a reference, supports to teach? Short answer, yes. Long answer, you have examples here. I wouldn't even say the civil rights movement is always accurately represented in textbooks. So we have it's a very loaded answer that I would probably give you for that. But starting with like the advocacy piece of what Ali Youth was just talking about, like voting on these things to change, comprehensive sex ed is great, the LGBTQ movement. I just think that in the K-12 schooling system, you have a lot of like standardized testing. So I'm in college, so I don't know, I don't work within that frame, but I try to bring LGBTQ plus people into any kind of space that I'm in. Because this idea of like, you know, a queer trans person not being in your field is a lie. So if you can like put queer and trans people into every single field, there is representation there, I promise you. But as far as K-12 schooling, I'd love to call on someone that's maybe more in that realm, and like what can you do around queer and trans movements in like your schooling?
I just want to plug two resources, Teaching Tolerance and GLSEN, GLSEN, GLSEN.
And I can speak to teaching movements a tiny bit. I just graduated from high school, so very fresh, recent experience in that realm. But I think, you know, teachers do have a lot of freedom. In Texas, at least, the TEKS have, you know, standards, and you definitely have to make sure that your content in your classroom but that doesn't prevent you from telling stories or from relating various topics just back to LGBTQ plus movements and other revolutions throughout history. So like, I know that junior year in my AP US history class, I had a teacher who was talking about, I'm pretty sure her name is Jane Addams. I might have that wrong, but she founded the Hull House, and she was a great like progressive advocate, but she was queer. And so my teacher just kind of mentioned that. I had one teacher who talked about Baron von, who was kicked out of the Prussian army for being gay, and then he came over to the US and helped George Washington win at Valley Forge. And so I think teacher, you know, you have a good degree of freedom, and obviously it was topics surrounding education. So just make up your when talking. It's not a
I kind of missed the last.
Thing is there. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I mean, there's so many resources and books and like things to look online, right? Like, there's some false, maybe information out there, but I mean, I think if you put in LGBTQ social movements, right, like a lot will come up. If you put in queer history, a lot will come up. And again, like you said, if we, you know, you can do a block on it. You can be like, hey, we're going to do a deep dive, or you can just, you know, gently weave it, you know, everywhere you go. But the resources are plentiful.
Absolutely. I'm gonna move over to the Q&A part because we do have 4 questions there, y'all. What would be a natural consequence for transgressors, perpetuators, and bullies, both children and adults? A natural consequence. Do any of y'all have any thoughts?
I mean, AISD about aggressors, I guess. I mean, I think sometimes we just don't like to talk about relationship violence in general. And I think when you add queer identities and trans identities in relationship violence, I think I know people get even more uncomfortable, and especially because there's a long, I mean, the flip side of that, right, is there's a long history of saying, especially that gay men were transgressors. I mean, that has been used as a false argument against adoption and all kinds of things, right? But like, we also have to believe people. We need to hear the stories. We need to stop you know, we need to stop it. And, you know, at AISD, sexual orientation and gender identity and gender expression are part of our harassment policy. Like, you can't do it. Right. And so it's also, and we're like really concretely, if we're talking about non-discrimination policy and anti-harassment policy, we have to include sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. Like, again, you can't say you're going to do the right thing. Like, you have to write it in, or I don't have legal recourse. And so, you know, we have to hold systems accountable, and we have to be able to tell our stories. And I know in the adult world, there's been a long history with police that when there was relationship violence within same-sex couples, which we don't talk a lot about because we're trying to have the perfect relationships so we don't get in trouble, police don't handle things well, right? Like, they think people are friends. They can't figure out who the aggressor is because everybody looks this, right? Like, think the taller person is going to be the bad one, right? Like, so I think there is a history, there are reasons why we suppress moving forward and telling our stories. And so I think, you know, like, there have to be cultural shifts and climate shifts in order for that to happen.
Resources are kind of my jam, so I'm just throwing them out there. For intimate partner violence in the LGBTQ community, the 2 resources I would recommend most are the Northwest Network, which is based out of Seattle. and the network LARED, which is based out of Boston, if I'm correct. But both of those are awesome for queer people, by queer people organizations that are working to combat intimate partner violence.
And Forge Forward works specifically on relationship violence around trans communities.
Love it. Thank y'all. About 20 minutes left still. Thinking about the possibility of at least some students will be 100% online in the fall. What is a great virtual way teachers can show and put procedures in place to make all students feel welcomed and safe?
You can always start your classroom off with a Google form, asking students about their names, pronouns, just basic information. You can hold breakout rooms and sessions for them. Some teachers at our school are setting up 10-minute sessions with each student to get to know them on a personal basis throughout the first 2 weeks. Just setting intentional space and time. I know it's weird doing it through Zoom if we're going back to being 100% online, even though we don't want that, but it's just making the intentional time and space to get to know each student. I know I say that from privilege because we have a smaller population. It's only 400 students in my whole high school, so we have the time and space to do so. But if you start as small as just a Google form, just to figure out who that student is, who they are, get to know them a little bit better, that's a simple one step you can do just to start as a platform.
Yeah, absolutely. And then even further with that, a thing that I put on Google Forms when I'm going to teach the classes is, do you want me to use these pronouns in this name in front of like parents? Do you want me to use these in front of students, other students? Do you want these to just be in between us? 'Cause some people are not out, so I don't want to like inadvertently out someone without knowing that I'm doing that. And then also this thing that most of us on this call have done, I think it should definitely be optional, is you can put your pronouns in your name on Zoom by clicking the little 3 dots next to your name and then going to rename. And that's an easy thing to maybe show students how to do at the beginning. But again, I would stress that it's like optional, so people don't feel obligated to out themselves if they don't want to.
I mean, I think one of the really important questions is, what pronouns do you use versus what pronouns do you prefer? Right? Like, we've got to get out of that kind of preferred place. One thing is, if you ask a student, if you ask anyone what pronouns they use, if they don't want to be out, they're going to tell you what they're going to use with you. If we say prefer, we often are pulling for something. It might get read that we're pulling for something people aren't ready to share. That's one reason why preference shouldn't be used. The other reason why preference shouldn't be used is cisgender people don't think, I don't think most cisgender people think of their pronouns as preferred, right? My pronouns are just my pronouns. My preference is that you use them well. And so we really have to get into the practice of asking everyone what pronouns they use, because we in 2020, it should have been true for longer, but definitely in 2020, we cannot assume what pronouns people use by looking. Because I have a lot of folks who use they, them, who don't look non-binary, whatever that look is supposed to be. So, like, yes, you shouldn't force people because they may not be comfortable. But I think when we ask what pronouns do you use, then most people know what they want to have used in the space that you're in. But asking what space that is also super important, because people do use different things in different spaces. And I would say, because we haven't said it out loud, and especially in the K through 12 space, in all spaces, like, confidentiality and not outing people is so important. And when people come out to you, really kind of thinking about what their circles of outness are, right? Like, are you the first person they've told? Are they out everywhere? Are they out in school and not at home? When I worked at the GSC, right, like, people were out in the GSC, people were out on campus, people were out to the bar district, and people were not out beyond Travis County lines, right? So we really have to honor kind of who knows, because, and outing people, like, the repercussions of that are immense, right? For a lot of people, it means losing their housing and their families. So the statistic of 25 to 40% of all people youth experiencing homelessness are queer or somewhere in the alphabet is still true. Marriage equality did not fix that.
Yeah, absolutely. Even in the gender and sexuality center, I love the idea, Sam, of doing like one-on-ones if we can do that. Because even with the gender and sexuality center, sometimes people don't even want to meet in the physical space because they're like, if I come here, then I'm automatically outed, or at least that's like how they feel. So then I'm like, okay, do we need to meet at a coffee shop? Like being accommodating in that kind of way. So maybe one-on-one conversations to get to know people are like helpful in the virtual realm. What do y'all feel like is the best way to access marginalized voices if they're homeless or some other way of not being digitally present?
I think I need more context to that for educational purposes to teach them. I'm a little bit. I think I would want more information on that.
Same, because I'm thinking like it's a lot of ways to hinder being digitally present, and it could be something like not being in a space that's like quiet enough, not having housing, not having the best like Wi-Fi connection, a whole lot of things there. So yeah, I love to know more there, but like thinking about some of the examples, a way that the GSC and UT at large has kind of like shifted to like COVID-19 and like bringing everything to the digital realm is allowing like Wi-Fi hotspots to students and things like that so that they can be digitally present. Another thing, if folks are experiencing housing crises, like getting them in touch with CARES Act funding. I'm sure like every institution at this point like uses that, or other kind of like resources. But yeah, it really depends on the intent of like, why are you trying to access these folks? I think that would better inform like how I would answer that. Does anyone else have any thoughts there? Okay.
Just accessibility of like devices and electronics. I would suggest like checking with your school district to see. I know Austin ISD has sent like Wi-Fi equipped buses into neighborhoods that are less that don't have as much Wi-Fi access to provide the students with a way to connect. And I know Out Youth is able to help folks gain access to electronics like donated laptops, donated tablets, things like that, if students are lacking the actual device to be able to connect to do their schoolwork. So definitely reach out to the folks in your community, your school district, whatever kind of youth organizations are in your community, and just check in with them if you know students especially who are needing access to those kinds of resources.
Hey, KB, I think I saw a question about the intersectionality specifically around sexual orientation, gender identity, and ability. Can I speak on that a little bit?
Yeah, Gwen Hung like dropped a resource for that I definitely would suggest, but totally say more on there.
Okay, I just want to make sure it got spoken, because I think ability is something in general that we don't talk a lot about. I think that ableism is one of those things that sometimes is not seen, so it doesn't get talked about. I believe that we don't talk about it because all of us know that at any moment our abilities can shift and change, and it scares us. And so we don't want to, we don't want to talk about it. It was shamed out of us as children to not talk about it. And it definitely exists in our community. Like ableism exists in our community, and it's something that we need to really think and talk about more. So, I want to say that. I think the other thing that I know that comes up a lot, and I have a friend who does research on it, is that we don't think of people with disability, often especially kind of cognitive or physical disabilities, as being sexual. And that isn't true, and we need to kind of get rid of that, right? I also know that a lot of our spaces, our queer spaces, are not friendly spaces to navigate, are like, sometimes not well funded, so they aren't super accessible, or they're older, older buildings, or that I think, like the conversation about ability just doesn't get brought forward. So that's the main reason that I thank you for the link, and I missed it. So now I'm going to go look and see what great resource you put. But I really wanted to just speak it into this space because I think society at large, and definitely our communities, need to be better and do better, and have more conversations about it.
No, I definitely want to echo that. Shane, according to PR Newswire, a study that they did, about 30% of folks in the queer community have some kind of disability. So it's not just a small percentage of the community, it is a large percentage of the community that we are ignoring if we don't make our spaces accessible. And when I say accessible, I'm not just talking about physical ability and putting in ramps and having ASL interpreters. It doesn't stop there. Are you using accessible language? Are we making the space accessible for folks with anxiety? All of those kinds of things matter. And yeah, I want to just like echo all of the sentiments around making sure that we make spaces that are accessible for everyone, because everything is so connected. Queerness is not a silo that is separate from race, separate from disability, separate from all of these other identities that people hold. We want to show up to spaces as our whole selves, and the way that we do that is having actual, queer folks with disabilities in the room when we're like designing our spaces, or doing kind of like audits around how to make our spaces accessible. We're bringing queer folks with disabilities like into our curriculum as well. It's so many interesting stuff about the intersection of like gender and physical ability. OMG, I would definitely suggest it. I have a resource specifically that's like escaping me now, but yeah, no, it's very important. And Gwen Hung and some students from the GSC made this resource that they shared a little bit earlier in the chat.
KB, what you said about making spaces accessible for folks with like anxiety and things like that made me think about a conversation that E and I had the other day about how inaccessible queer spaces can be for folks in recovery, who are trying to, be sober, and also just how inaccessible it is for queer youth to create community and to have spaces that they can hang out together if they're not 21. So I think that's part of the conversation that we need to be having, and like listening to the youth and finding ways to give them what they're telling us they need.
Absolutely, being intergenerational in the way that we view queerness is very important. Like, not all queer people are 21 to 35, contrary to popular belief. So how are we having conversations on like queer elders and making them feel comfortable in our spaces? How are we making queer youth feel comfortable in our spaces? And we've been talking a lot about classrooms, but what about when they are outside of classrooms? It makes no difference if they feel accepted in classrooms and not accepted anywhere else. So yeah, thank you so much. We're happy to send these resources to someone that asks that. But I think that we can leave with this one more question here about how can one assist someone to explore their gender expression and not necessarily default to a cisgender stereotype to gain acceptance. And that's in the Q&A.
Quit gendering everything. Right? Like, we gender we gender everything, right? And like, you know, the gender rule book that we hand little kids and then everybody polices everybody around it, right? Like, the way you get to explore it is not to be like put on a path and told that's where you have to go, right? So if you don't know the work of Rebecca Bigler, she's somebody that I would recommend reading if you like geeking out on academic stuff. She writes about how little children learn stereotypes around race and how they learn stereotypes around gender. And she wrote a curriculum that was used in a school in town where she taught little kids to push back against gender stereotypes, right? So if a teacher were to pick up a pink backpack and say, what little girl lost their backpack? The students were taught to say to the teacher, pink is not a gender, that could be anybody's backpack, right? And I'm like, yes, right? So in order to explore, we have to open up the freedom to do it, right? And so if little kids are like, one of my favorite stories is a friend of mine who has her PhD. Her son came to her and said, had heard somebody call her doctor in her last name and said to her, you can't be a doctor, you're a woman. And it was like, A, I'm not the kind of doctor you're talking about, and B, yes, I can be, right? So it's like, so to be really curious and be like, wow, I'm so interested in that. Where did you learn that, right? Like, why do you think that's true, right? So really, you know, if we work with little children, you know, if we work with children as they're growing up developmentally to unpack pink and blue and, you know, this and that, and if we don't shame people when they step out of their gender boxes and try on things and are just really open and curious about it, I think that's right. That because the minute you're shamed about it, you stop, and then you work your way through your shame or not, and you try again, right? And so every time we have an experience that we're successful in that, we step forward, and every time we're shamed, we step back. I told my mom when I was 9 that I thought I wanted to be a boy. And she's like, no, you don't, and you'll never speak of it again. And I came out at 34, right? And I don't want to be a boy. But it took me a hell of a long time, right, to be able to get back to that space. So I think, you know, if we can really just open up curiosity and shut down the shoulds and the shouldn'ts, and it's hard because media, right, just perpetuates it on steroids all the time. So
absolutely. I'd go even further to say that, like, there's no one way to express any gender. So, like, starting the conversation with just saying that, like, yes, we have the terms masculinity and femininity, but that does not mean like men own masculinity and women own femininity. And there's like no non-binary folks don't necessarily owe you androgyny. You know what I mean? Anyone can express any gender in the way that they would like to. So if someone is trying to, you know, explore different ways that they can express their gender, and we do that through clothes, we do that through the way that we speak, we do that through like me moving my hands around a lot, is like the way that I express whatever I want to do. So just coming at it in a way that doesn't already put people at a like, okay, I have to like work within this box of femininity. And it's like, what if you didn't? What if masculinity and femininity just flowed through you like water? That doesn't make you any less of a woman or a man or whatever gender that you decide to refer to yourself as. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I definitely want to say I agree with the media. situation, I would definitely suggest, I just saw this very cool documentary called Disclosure about trans representation in media. If you want to learn about the history there and the history of how trans folks have shown up in media and how that actually is not reflective of how trans people are in real life. They're just reflective of like stigmas and stereotypes around that identity, and just knowing and also entering those conversations with people having those questions, with saying that like media is not a representation of real life. It is a microcosm, you know, of people, whereas it's like billions of people in the actual world that are expressing their gender any which way that they would like to. But yeah.
And I would say stay off of YouTube sometimes. A lot of my younger students go to YouTube, especially when they're like getting into their transition. They're like, well, they've been on testosterone for a year and they have all this hair and their body looks like this and all these things and comparisons. And I'm like, you are exactly where you're supposed to be at this moment and you need to accept where you are. Like, stop comparing everyone's transition or everyone's experience to where you're supposed to be. Your genetic makeup, your levels, everything about you is not going to match anyone else. Be cool with the spectrum, be cool with your body, own your body, it's beautiful, and be fluid. It's totally cool. If you feel awkward some days, you're going to feel awkward. Some days you're going to love yourself, some days you're just going to feel like blah, but you're still beautiful. Everything else is it's just matter. I tell the kids, it's just matter when you think about it. Like, don't take yourself too seriously when you're discovering who you are. Just enjoy the journey.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Real quick. I mean, I think the other thing that's just really important, which goes to, it's kind of adding on to what Sam says, right? Like, there's no one trans narrative, right? There's also not a way to be trans, right? And that we have to remember in all communities, you know, that one of the things that keeps oppression in place is kind of that divide and conquer thing, right? So as somebody who's been in this community a really long time, right? Like, I remember back in the day when the genderqueer community was fighting like hell to be part of the trans community, right? And like 20 years later, the genderqueer and non-binary community is like, no, we're not. I'm like, hey, y'all, I fought for 20 years to get us in. Like, hey, but like that, like, you're not trans enough, or you non-binary folks are trying to shut down, you know, people transition. It's like, it doesn't serve us well to get in that, right? And so, you know, we just have to be mindful, both we, those of us in the community, and for folks who are cisgender, to not like buy into the narrative of like, oh, you're going to transition, what are you going to get done, and when are you going to get that done, and oh, well, you're not trans enough because you're not doing the thing, right? Or I didn't have top surgery for a really long time because I was afraid that people, if I had top surgery, thought I would want to be a man. And I was like, nope, just take my chest. Like, it doesn't make me a man. And so we also just really have to push back, not only against kind of traditional expectations of what men and women are, but we also have to push back about expectations of what trans experience and trans identity and trans and non-binary journeys look like. And so, and I'll tell you, as somebody, right, like, that is a lot to fight against, right? Like, I had to fight against cis folks to make space for myself, and then I had to fight against trans folks to make space for myself. And we gotta, all those communities have got to quit it and just be really honoring of where people are at. And again, if you're curious about people's journeys, either where their journey has come from and to, or the journey that they want to go from here forward, like, you don't get to ask. You just don't. Unless you know me really well, or I'm in a training room and you're paying me really well. You don't, you know, like, our bodies are sacred, and they're our bodies. And being curious about them isn't okay. Even if you want to date us, being curious about our bodies, until you need to know about our bodies, it's not okay.
Thank y'all. Thank y'all so much for being a part. I really don't have anything left. This was kind of like my dream team panel, so I'm glad that it worked out the way that it did, and I'm glad we had a lot of time to ask folks questions. Like E is putting in the chat, if you have feedback or more questions, please fill out their feedback form here. If you'd like to know more information about the things, or like recap the things that we've said in this panel, this is recorded and this will be posted, I believe, on Out Youth's like YouTube page or something like that. So please, if you'd like to support the work and help make sure that things like this keep happening, Queering Education, this project, feel free to make a donation to Out Youth in the link that E just put. But that's really it. Out Youth. E, do y'all have anything?
Yeah, I just want to thank y'all. Yeah, like you said, this is the dream team. So I'm super excited to get to see y'all and hear everything you had to say. Thank you, E, for dreaming this up. Thank you everyone who attended. We hope that you'll join us for the next Queering Education sessions. We've got one tomorrow on how to use stories and numbers to advocate for inclusive policies at school. We've got two next week. One is on accessing reproductive health care for minors in Texas, and one on finding queer-friendly employment. And I will turn it over to E before we close out.
Yeah, so just echoing what Frederick just said, thank you all so much for joining us, for being part of this. Yeah, thank you to our panelists. You're all amazing people. So glad we have you as a part of this. And yeah, if you'll check the chat, we have a feedback form. We'd love if you would fill it out, and that just helps us to cater our content better in the future and make sure we know what things you liked and things you don't like. And definitely, if you're able or if you want to, please to make a donation. One thing that we're really committed to is making sure that all of our speakers get paid for sharing their expertise and experience. So if you would like, please feel free to do that. But thank you all so much, and I hope to see you at tomorrow's session.